But good evening, our Rotary colleagues and friends in peace. Tonight, we have the opportunity to find common ground, something from which we all can benefit. I'm going to assume you've read the extensive background of our presenter, Stephen Hawkins. He's the director he's the director of research for More in Common. Stephen, let's take it away.
Thank you, Jim. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all. I live here in Denver, and so really it's an honor to be able to be in conversation with you all and speak at this really interesting and unusual moment. First time in 100 years that our Congress has not been able to find a speaker, but interesting for many other ways too. So here I go. I'm going to try and share my screen for this PowerPoint and see how that goes.
1, 2, 0, 8, 7, 6, 3, 4. That mine?
And I would ask if everybody but Stephen would mute themselves.
Yes.
Okay, so are you seeing my display view or the correct view?
We're good.
All right. Great. Well, I'll just jump right in. So I work for an organization called More in Common, and More in Common was set up about 6 years ago in the United Kingdom, and we work in Europe and in the United States. And we're worried about political division, social conflict. We advise political parties, we give reports to the government, we release all of our data to academia, we advise business groups and faith communities and so on, work with the Catholic Church, the BBC, etc. This political division isn't an American phenomenon, it's a pretty general phenomenon, and it's a challenging one. No one really has the answers yet. So we have teams in France, Germany, the UK, Poland, and Spain, as well as the US. And our work is heavily integrated with academia. So some of what I present tonight will be our original research, but a lot of what we have done is drawing from the work of social scientists, either in political science or social psychology, and trying to build on the work that's already in the academic literature and make it useful and make it relevant to what's happening in present day countries. We also design interventions. A lot of it is we test communication strategies. We do a lot of interviews with people, a lot of focus groups, a lot of polls, and that data helps us to inform strategies for how we can reduce political division and better reach across political and social divides. What we're best known for is that we create what are called political typologies or segmentations, and these are other ways of describing our political landscapes, rather than just describing people as Republican, Democrat, and Independent, or as men and women, or Black and white, and rural and urban. What we try to do is capture people's perspectives. What does their psychology tell us? What does their behavior tell us? And then we work with statisticians to capture these pockets of different perspectives, and then we describe them in a way that should be data-oriented and empathetic. And then we present those to the world, and we've given these categories to our partners and to and they're broadly available within each country that we work in, and they've helped to describe the landscape of division in each of our countries. For instance, here in the United States, this is the depiction that we created in 2018 in our Hidden Tribes study, which describes a group called the exhausted majority that I'll get into a little bit later. But first, I just want to also provide a little bit on a personal background. I'm there on the right side of that picture. I'm standing in front of a banner that says College Republicans. This was me about 15, 16 years ago. I was very active as a college Republican in Washington, D.C. I grew up in an evangelical home. I grew up my family's from Atlanta, Georgia, from the South. And that was very much the spirit of my upbringing. It was a very strong part of my identity. I was very excited about that. I worked for Republican congressmen. And then I slowly gave up a lot of those identities and changed my mind about a lot of things. And by 2017, this is me standing in Manhattan, working for an activist organization, an LGBTQ-run activist organization, very progressive, trying to change people's minds on issues like climate change and women's issues. And so I've really kind of spanned the whole spectrum from the right to the left, from evangelical to atheist. And today I would situate myself somewhere else, not really a Republican, not really an activist, worried about the country, but very committed to finding ways of improving our dialogue. And that's what brings me to this work today. So what I want to just do in this next 35 or 40 minutes here is I want to describe the conflict first. And this will be familiar as politically active people such that you are, who read the news, who are probably following some of the big research that comes out, polling and things like this. This should help just create some common table stakes. I'm also going to present some data that's really, really fresh just from the last few weeks that More in Common has collected. Again, More in Common does a lot of polling, so we have our pulse on public opinion sort of month to month. Then I want to get into some interpretation. What can we say about this conflict? How can we understand it better? And then I'll conclude with some opportunity about what reasons we have to be hopeful and what we can do about it. So first, let's just jump in to describing the conflict. 50 years ago, if you asked Republicans and Democrats, do you think that there are big differences between the parties? About half of Americans would say no, there aren't very big differences between the political parties. There was a problem in the middle of the 20th century in the United States, which was that political scientists thought there was too little in terms of differentiation between Republicans and Democrats. The parties were too similar, and we needed to have more options, more clear party differences. It used to be, of course, the case that Republicans had more liberal members and Democrats had more conservative members who were pro-life and so on. Now there's much more of an ideological coherence to the parties. And now there's a lot of political hostility, right? What we call affective polarization in political science is the sense that the other party isn't just wrong, they're brainwashed, they're hateful, they're racist. And you can see there, that's overwhelmingly how we describe each other. It's one of the most naked, open, one of the most open hostilities that people have in society today is between political parties, maybe more so than any other type of conflict between groups. This is a complicated amount of data to digest, so I'm just going to talk you through it. In 2018, we gave people two options. We said, which do you agree with more? That people you agree with politically need to stick to their beliefs and fight, or that they need to be willing to listen to others and compromise? And so you can see there on the far left, 40% of people in 2018 said, I want people I agree with politically to stick to their beliefs and fight. In the last 4 years, that number has crawled up to 51%. So that's now the majority position. Instead of most Americans saying, I want people to my side to listen to others and find compromise, it's now actually just neck and neck. You can see they're 51 to 49. So the country's at an interesting point where we see that the more politically engaged folks, so those would be the people on the far left and the far right, are far more likely to say that they want their side to stick to their beliefs and fight. And that's a general trend true. We're seeing more and more people saying compromise is not the right strategy here. And that's interesting because it's happening at the same time that people are saying that they see extremism on both sides of the political spectrum, right? So we asked this question, do you see, how much do you agree with the following statement? Extremists on both sides of the political spectrum present a threat to America. And we get 65% agreement. And what's interesting is look at Democrats and Republicans there in the second and third row, right? 61% of Democrats agree with that. 66% of Republicans agree with that. There's very little difference there in the way that they see it. Independents, of course, see that more than either group. But it's interesting that that is true at the same time that we also say that we are our own greatest threat. The greatest threat to the nation is coming from within. We've asked this in multiple ways, but regardless of quite how you formulate the question, between 80 and 90% of Americans say the biggest threat is not Russia, the biggest threat is not China, the biggest threat is us, it's other Americans. And you can see that it's just not a controversial statement to say that. Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Black, White, Hispanic, Asian, it's a consensus viewpoint that our internal divisions are really the thing that could be our undoing. And so this is data from from November, from just after the midterms. We fielded this just in the week after the election happened. We see that people say, the emotions I'm feeling towards America today are frustration, disappointment, disgust, exhaustion, anger, fear, confusion. Very few people registering excitement or hope. And so part of what's happening here is that as our political parties have become ideological, and what I mean by that is at any point in history, you're going to have in your population people who lean more to the right, more conservative. We should respect traditions. We should have people be more accountable for their own lives. We should embrace and celebrate religion, versus people who are more liberal, people who say we need to care more and be more empathetic towards those who have been mistreated. The government needs to do more to help. We need to change more than we need to stay the same. But what's happened is the concentration of conservatism and liberalism has coincided more and more with political parties. I think Pew has done the best research on this. You can see here in 1994, the overlap between perspectives, conservatives and liberals, was pretty big. That purple mountain in the middle there that you see in 1994 is showing how much overlap there was between Republicans and Democrats in the way that they answered questions, showing there's only a little bit of ideological gap between them. And now you can see in 2017 that those have moved further and further apart, so that the space of overlap and perspective on important political issues has gotten smaller and smaller. And that's, again, from 6 years ago. So those would have drifted even further apart in the last 6 years. Now that's made political parties a little bit less popular. You can see here party identification around the time of, let's say, Obama's first election was pretty high, where Democrats and independents and Republicans were pretty close in number. But today, more and more Americans are identifying as independent. We see about 42% of Americans saying that they identify as independent, and fewer people identifying with the political parties. One of the biggest challenges in the country, of course, is that the president's seen as illegitimate by his opposition, meaning the Republican Party. This isn't from our own survey, but in November of 2021, 27% of Republicans said that they thought that Biden was the rightful winner of the election. And legitimacy is a recurring problem. Really, every change in presidential leadership in the United States this century has come with some cloud of illegitimacy around it. In 2000, Bush's election was seen as illegitimate by nature of the intervention by the Supreme Court to stop the recount in Florida. In 2008, the claims of birtherism around Obama meant that some people didn't think he was really American. 2016, Donald Trump's election was seen as illegitimate because of alleged Russian collusion. And most recently, Biden's election was claimed to be stolen by Trump. Now, those claims aren't equally valid to any extent. I don't agree with all of those claims at all. But it does mean that we're entering into a period where the norm now is that it's not just that people oppose the political leadership, it's that they see it as illegitimate, that there's been cheating in order to come to power. And that's coinciding with a decline in trust, right? So trust was very high in the 1950s and a little bit before that. 4 out of 5 Americans said that they would trust the government in Washington to do what's right, just about always or most of the time. Now that number is close to 1 in 5. It's completely inverted. If you ask about trust in national corporations or big corporations, it's also around 20% or lower. And trust in the media is also very low. Sorry, this slide is where I meant to go there. You can see that, of course, one of the big problems in our country is that if you ask people which news sources they trust, among Republicans, there's only one news source that gets a majority of trust. That's Fox News, but even Fox News only gets 50% or so trust. And other news sources are struggled to have 20 to 30% of trust among Republicans. Very few sources of information that enjoy broad trust across the population. The conflict seems more cultural than political. We're going to get into that a little bit later in the interpretation. But this is a really interesting development in my view, which that, the presumed Republican candidate for president, Ron DeSantis, takes on Disney as his big political move in 2022. That's not an accident. There's a conflict about who we are in America. Is America a place of a great place? Is it a place we should be proud of, or is it a place that is stained by the abuse of power of white supremacy and a place that we should be ashamed of? How do we think about gender? How do we think about family? How do we think about fairness and poverty and meritocracy? All of this is much more about who we are and what our values are and what words we use to describe ourselves than it is about the old-fashioned the old-fashioned debate about what should the appropriate size of government be, which used to be the divide between left and right. The right said the government should do less. Left side of the government, or Democrats, said that the government should do more. We're really in different territory now. Joe Biden ran on a ticket in 2020, a campaign of saying that he's going to try and build unity, seemed to be a unifying figure potentially. Has not succeeded, at least in terms of his appeal and his approval. We see people feel the country's on the wrong track, and despite perhaps best efforts on the Biden administration's part, we are in a cadence of partisanship and conflict that has in no way changed during the Biden administration towards a period of reconciliation and decline in division. And in this context of low trust and political division, we're also seeing that most are scared to express their views. This is from a survey data collected by Cato Institute a couple of years ago. So that's a right-wing group. But what they find is that Americans are either split or sure, depending on which political where they land on the political spectrum, about whether they're allowed to express their opinions. There's a lot of fear of causing offense. We found in our research that 80% of Americans said that they think political correctness is a problem today. That was 5 years ago almost now. I think if we asked about cancel culture today, that would be maybe a more relevant term than political correctness. But this isn't a problem that's isolated to the right. It's not a problem that's isolated to white Americans or to Christians or conservatives. We found that Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, men, women, younger generations, all of them, three-quarters or more, said that they think political correctness is a problem today. And so in the context of all of these challenges, the discourse itself, which is the medium of change, which is the method that we use to try and reduce down the conflict and to try and bring about resolution, or at least to try and make headway, itself is struggling. Conversation itself is very challenging today. And so naturally, that means that we're worried, right? This is one of a few points that are really consensus across the board here, no matter whether you're looking at race or looking at generation or looking at political party. If you ask people if they're worried about the future of the country, they are. So a few things to kind of summarize this introduction to sort of describing the conflict. Incentives are really a big problem here. It's our mechanism for change in democracy is changing the cast of characters, right? Change the personnel. We elect different people, and hopefully new ideas, new personalities can bring about change. But what we find in the research is that, and this is not from my own research, but from political science more generally, is that incentives within the political system are towards conflict and partisanship. Political incentives like fundraising, like media attention, like turning out the vote. Negativity and conflict and fear are very useful. Conflict resolution, moderation, these things are far less useful for fundraising purposes and for getting out voters and so on. And of course, within the media, of course, we know that conflict sells better than good news. And that's true of social media too. The social media algorithms are calibrated such that, at least in the case of Facebook, outrage is more useful, it's more profitable than hope. And so if you, and this makes intuitive sense, I think, if you're scrolling through your news feed, you see something that makes you hopeful or happy, you scroll on by, maybe you have a smile. But if something seems crazy to you or terrifying to you, you're likely to click on it, to comment, to share it with friends. It keeps you engaged. You might spend 40 minutes on it. Well, that's something which social media companies have capitalized on. And then finally, there's this challenge here of social incentives. In the political science term for this is stacking. But what it refers to is the fact that whereas before, let's say at the turn of the last century, 100 years ago, let's say, you had Democrats and Republicans and everybody kind of intermixing. Today, it's far more common for people to move to places that are characterized by their political cultures. And so it's likely that you're not just a New Yorker, but you're a New Yorker and a liberal and college educated and secular and a Democrat. And so we're moving into places that have more homogeneity rather than less intergroup interaction. And what that does is it actually accelerates this process of us being more afraid of each other, because we don't have as many mental reference points for people who are in these other categories. And so it allows us to sort of take in some of the misrepresentation and some of the worst representatives of other sides, because we just don't interact directly with people from the other parties very much. So what are the consequences of this type of conflict? Well, it limits our ability to address big problems that we need to coordinate around. It means we can't address culturally sensitive problems because there's so much policing of language and so much anxiety around that. New problems we've never had to address before, such as social media regulation or artificial intelligence regulation, are just problems that are unlikely to get addressed quickly because we have so much political conflict. And I would argue that it also elevates the potential severity of other challenges because we just don't have the capacity to collectively coordinate solutions. So let's get into a bit of interpretation. This is going to be drawing on More in Commons research pretty heavily now. So we have a report in 2018 that came out called Hidden Tribes, a study of America's polarized landscape. This was a big deal for my organization when it came out. It got front page coverage in the New York Times, CNN, got coverage in now several hundred news articles written about it. And then in 2019, we released The Perception Gap, which is about how we misunderstand each other. And I just want to talk through about some of the main ideas that are a part of this. So one is that the wings, which are the fringes on the left and the right, are the groups that tend to define the political space. These are people who are more active on social media about politics. These are people who donate to political candidates. These are people who contact their members of Congress. These are people who participate in protests. And so it's very much the case that these are the people who sort of shape what the political conversation sounds like. But we found that about 2/3 of Americans represent something we call the exhausted majority. And the exhausted majority is not politically homogenous. You've got Democrats in there, you've got independents, you've got politically disengaged, you've got moderates, you've got some conservatives. But what the exhausted majority has in common is that they tend not to see themselves very well reflected in the political debate. They're interested in political compromise. They're frustrated with the political system, and they could serve as a useful community to sort of as a countervailing force against the political conflict we see in the country. It used to be the case that in the United States, you have a political issue, people might debate it. You might be pro-choice, but you're pro-gun. You might be in favor of immigration, but you're also, I don't know, have a conservative view on taxes. We see less of this today. We see that there is more, as related back to this point about the ideological nature of our political parties. We see that you can kind of pick whatever issue it is, and the same groups of people will agree with each other and disagree with each other as these issues become more and more involved in these big stories of political ideology. So I'm going to get into a little bit more detail of what I mean by that in a minute. But for instance, on the screen here, you can see that on issues as different as immigration and sexual harassment, you find that if you give people the two big picture options for what they think about each of these issues, you see that the progressive activists on the left at the very top there overwhelmingly agree with each other on one perspective. The devoted conservatives on the right disagree with that perspective completely. And these are issues which in a healthy culture, people would be making up their own minds about. They wouldn't always be tribally connected and always think the same way as their peers. But that isn't what we see today. We see a lot of groupthink today. We also see some things which might look a little bit like a contradiction or a paradox, but actually are not. So here we have on the x-axis on the bottom of your screen there, we asked this question: do you think political correctness is a problem? I referred to this earlier. 80% of Americans did. This is from and what you can see is that the groups there depicted in these yellow circles, overwhelmingly people say political correctness is a problem. But then on the y-axis, you see we asked this question if hate speech is a problem, and most people think that it is as well. And so you see that people both recognize that there's a problem in our discourse of people not being respectful of each other and expressing hate, but that the policing of our language, the political correctness rules around our language, are also widely resented. Maybe it's analogous to saying crime is a problem, but the policing is also a problem, right? So we see that there's this these tensions which play out, and right now people are kind of just frustrated in multiple directions. And so the exhaustive majority would say is frustrated with America. It feels forgotten, that the government is rigged. It's more flexible in terms of people aren't as rigidly trapped into one perspective or another, and they're more willing to find compromise as compared to groups on the wings, people on the left and the far right. This is a depiction of 8,000 survey respondents put on a scatter plot. On the x-axis here, we have left to right. On the y-axis, up and down, we have their political engagement. If you look at it, it creates a U shape. And that U shape is really important to understand because it shows that the people in the middle are lower down, which means the people in the middle of the spectrum are less politically engaged. The people on the fringes, more to the left and more to the right, are higher up, meaning they're more politically engaged. So the voices that people hear in the media, the voices that political operatives and politicians listen to are going to hear are far more likely to be on the far left and far right than in the middle. So yes, so the exhaustive majority, you get it, they're less politically engaged. We did some interviews with folks. This is an interview actually with the New York Times, that we connected some people to the New York Times reporters. They described what this political moment feels like, fighting over the same quarter mile of ground and nothing happens, feeling that politicians don't care about them, feeling that everybody is just so right or the left and anybody in the middle is just kind of afraid, not sure what's happening. So I want to go a little bit deeper into the psychology now of the different perspectives in our political landscape. And I want to start by talking about values. This is one of the most important insights that I've learned in my adult life about the differences between people on the right and the left. And it comes from something called moral foundations theory. This is academic work done by a social psychologist named Jonathan Haidt, who's at NYU. And what he identified is that we have a different subconscious set of values that maybe we can't articulate because it's something that we received from our culture and maybe we received partially from our genetics too. But these values mean that events that unfold around us that have a moral nature to them, they feel differently to us. We care about them and experience them differently, right? It's analogous maybe to the way that food works, where some foods are spicy for you, but not spicy for someone else. We have a different kind of moral palate. And so this is so relevant because it's important to understand that if you project yourself into somebody else's mind, it can sometimes be baffling to understand what is it that's motivating them to think differently or to disagree with me on this point. And the truth is that there are very different values underlying people's perspectives on different sides of the spectrum. The progressive activists on the far left there, you'll see that their highest values are care and fairness. These are great values. These are universal values. empathy towards others, a desire to reduce suffering, a desire for fairness. But as you move more to the right, you see that people care about other things like authority and loyalty and purity. These are group values rather than universal values, but they're also very useful, right? Thank God we had people who believed in loyalty and had a strong sense of national identity in the middle of the 20th century to sign up for foreign wars and to defend our country. And the preservation of authority is important for any big country or any big entity that wants to preserve order. And so conservatives care about things like that. They care more about loyalty, they care more about authority. This is on the basis of hundreds of thousands of interviews. And progressives tend to care less about those things, more about these universal values. So I want to move on now to identity. Identity, there's a lot that can be said about this. We've spent at More in Common much of the last 2 years studying American identity. If you're interested in the subject, we have a couple reports around American fabric. This talks about American history, attitudes towards our attitudes towards the legacy of racism. We've explored this really a huge amount in depth. But there are a couple things to point out here. One is that despite all of the tensions in the United States, especially around race and racism and its place in the United States, we find that most Americans say that they're proud to be American. We find that most say that they're grateful to be American. And this transcends race. The place where this is most contentious is along generational lines. If you look at the silent generation, that's the far yellow column on the far right there, 94% of people who are a silent generation say they're proud to be American. Among Gen Z, that would be 51% of people say they're proud to be American. So we're entering into an era where it's more and more common for younger generations who were born in the wake of the financial crisis, the Trump era, the Afghanistan war era, don't have as much pride in being American. And then also progressive activists versus devoted conservatives. The political spectrum is it shows the most difference in terms of pride in being American, with progressive activists really rejecting a lot of the idea of being proud of being American and really taking on instead a sense of responsibility to correct those things that are wrong about the country. And so this tension around shared identity is really, really crucial. Francis Fukuyama at Harvard writes a lot about this in his book on identity, because as the United States is not an ethnic nation, we don't have a single ethnicity or religion that brings us together. We are a creedal nation, meaning that we have a common creed or belief system around the institutions that bring us together and what individual freedoms we have and so on. It's really important that we preserve and cultivate a sense of shared identity as Americans. It can't be an empty category that doesn't have any meaning behind it. So many of us in this space of political depolarization work and bipartisan work are interested in what we can do to try and fortify our sense of shared American identity, not to make people be unthinkingly proud of it, but to have that connection with other Americans be meaningful so that we can turn to it when we need to. Lastly, in this interpretation system, I want to talk about the big stories that are kind of underlying the perspectives on the left and the right. So I'm going to start here with the perspective on the left. And starting with a picture of a big march in Washington, D.C. You can see people protesting with their signs by the Capitol building. And the perspective on the left says really that life is shaped by power and by groups. And really where you end up in life hinges therefore on luck and circumstance, because your group is bigger than you. And which group you land in is in some ways just a spin of the wheel. And so really, we need to see that success is not so much an individual thing, but it's about luck and circumstance. Healthy societies are ones that listen and empathize with those who are least powerful. And group outcomes vary due to abuses of power, right? Systemic advantages, biases, and social norms that protect the privileged. And so if we want to create a fairer society, a more caring society, we need to redesign our systems and norms and redistribute power. And what success looks like is, well, it looks like every group having an equal share. And so we talk about equity and representation. So that's the left-wing worldview. And that story has a lot of validity, in my opinion, right? You're looking at big historical forces that therefore it makes sense that when you listen to progressives, they're using words like structural and oppression and a revolution and marginalization, right? Because they're looking at society through a macro level lens. It's really influenced heavily by Marx. It's influenced by Foucault, one who's focused so much on class and group identity, the other who focused on power. And I see a lot of validity in that. But the big story on the right starts much earlier. It starts long before the analysis of Marx and Foucault, and it starts really more at the origin of Judeo-Christianity and in the Garden of Eden. And the Garden of Eden is a story that says that suffering comes into the world through our own failings, our own inability to manage our desires, and evil comes into the world through our own failings. And so that life is really shaped by the quality of character that you embody. And so you can be successful through hard work and effort. And healthy societies need to have a lot of emphasis on responsibility, self-discipline. And groups differ because cultures differ, education differs, differences and choices are really important. And therefore, the thing that society needs to do is create opportunity and then let people compete through hard work and effort. And success varies according to individual merit. And so this maybe more Calvinist, Protestant story underlies a lot of the perspective on the right. And so it's why you have words like rules, self-discipline, accountability, work ethic. My view is that these two stories are really not contradictory. They're complementary. Groups do have power, but character also matters. Luck and circumstance, of course, play a huge, huge role, but so does hard work and effort. And at the same time that there needs to be listening and empathy, personal responsibility and self-discipline matter as well. And so I think part of what's happening in our political discourse is we're addicted to one story or the other here, and we're not allowing the friction, the complementarity between these two stories to play out. We're so focused on group differences that we don't allow conversations about culture and individuality to come up forward, or we're so resistant to the idea of hearing about privilege and hearing about biases that we don't allow it in the conversation, but really both work in tandem. Okay, now I want to just conclude here as the final section. I want to talk about reasons to be optimistic and reasons to places that we can put some of our energy. So the first is that political compromise is often within reach. So this is a survey that we did in 2019. What we were trying to do here is find, is there a way to talk about immigration policy in a way that registers with agreement across the political spectrum? So you can see here, we asked people on a scale from 0 to 100, how much do you agree with this statement? And you can see the average agreement is 78 out of 100, and it doesn't drop below 70 anywhere on the political spectrum. And that statement was, America can be both strong and compassionate. We can protect our borders at the same time that welcome immigrants who respect our laws and values. And what it shows is that for leaders who are willing to recognize the values of both sides, so in the case of progressives, emphasizing empathy, emphasizing welcoming. In the case of conservatives, talking about preserving order, talking about respecting shared identity, talking about having strength, right? If you are able to pivot between these two value systems, talk to conservatives, talk to liberals, you can get pretty high agreement even on some of the most contentious political issues. I talked a lot about the importance of shared identity. Building shared identity is something that can still work, right? So this is from a survey we did more recently. This is from 2021. But we asked people what their level of agreement was with a statement that says things like that America's made incredible contributions and ugly errors, but that we don't need to be ashamed to be American. We just need to have responsibility to learn from our past and to fix our mistakes. And there on the right, you can see that the agreement with that shown in the black line. As you move away from the center, that shows more agreement. You can see that there's very high levels of agreement that are consistent across Democrats, Republicans, across racial groups. It's possible to find the language to talk about our shared identity that really isn't very alienating. The problem with this is that it's boring. It's simply dull. It's hard to run a political campaign or print out bumper stickers that say, we're doing fine, or say, we're getting better, let's try and grow. The political operatives, and I come from a background of working in political consulting and helping political candidates. This is not a fundraisable campaign strategy or fundraising campaign strategy. And so the challenge is, how can we make the common ground that people are responsive to and that we know exists exciting and in the interests of political actors? Okay, a few more slides here. So there's no way that you can interpret this data here, but it's just to show one thing, and that's that, well, a few things. One is that there are many, many organizations working on this problem. More in Common is one of the organizations that's well known, especially because of our Hidden Tribes study. But there are about 400 organizations, last count, in the United States that are trying to do this work at a local level, at a national level. And I would kind of differentiate between three types of intervention. There are groups that are trying to work on sort of policy level solutions. There are groups that are working on building communities. And then there are groups that are working on trying to improve our culture. But what we find, and this is from research that came out just, I suppose in September maybe of last year from Stanford University, is that many, many, many types of brief interventions help reduce the political hostilities in our culture. So these pink, green, and blue bars here are just showing the impact in reducing negative attitudes across party lines through short interventions. And what do I mean by intervention? Playing a 3-minute video that shows how Democrats misunderstand Republicans and overstate how crazy and different they are, or how crazy and different Democrats are from Republicans. People find that content useful, informative, and it changes and reduces their level of anxiety and fear and opposition to the other side. Some of these interventions are being done by big corporations. Heineken is a group that I've recently been in conversation with. They've been doing great content that allows people to kind of break through some of these barriers. There's a lot of interest in the private sector and in philanthropy in working on these problems. More in Common receives funding from groups on the left, from the center, and from the right, because political polarization is seen as a threat, and it's seen that way kind of across the political spectrum. And finally, there are these interventions into culture. In my bio that Jim shared, I think the last sentence there said that I'm working on one. So just to give an overview of that, I'm launching something called Steelman Studio. And it's a concept about having better conversations, understanding perspectives with empathy, having conversations that are informed by evidence, and bringing in all sorts of different influences to try and better understand our moment and better understand each other, whether those are political actors, whether they're cultural actors, fictional characters, former presidents or former leaders in our country. Really interested in having great interviews and in helping people to better understand each other. I feel like people such as myself, who've spent a lot of time in different places on the political spectrum, have the opportunity to help empathize with and convey to others what the perspectives and values and psychology are of people in different places in our spectrum. And so my mission here with Steelman Studio is to have conversations and conduct political analyses that are defined by curiosity and humility and laughter, and to have conversations that have empathy but are also grounded in evidence, under the belief that everyone's experience matters, but that it's crucial for us to maintain a common language of facts and to be able to share a reality by keeping the evidence in the conversation, and also to give hope for the future, right? As I showed in the first section, concern about the future is really high at a moment when we could be excited about what the future has, because we're also on the precipice of the greatest period of material prosperity in human history. And we could be looking forward to that, not just dreading our own political conflict. And the name steel man comes from the opposite of straw man, right? A straw man argument is one in which you misrepresent your political opponent or your debate partner's viewpoints. You undermine them in a way that's taking cheap shots. But a steel man argument is to build up the other perspective in the conversation, to show respect to the perspective that you don't agree with, and then to find ways of working with and explaining it better and bringing it in conversation. So that's what I'm working on now. And Jim, I'm turning it back over to you for Q&A.
And you can unmute yourself before you talk. And do you want to take down your screen, Stephen? And beautiful, thank you. Wow, that's worthy of about 2 days, I think, at least. Stephen, what a tremendous amount of information. I'm going to open, because I have the floor, I guess, now, but I follow Stephen Putnam's work an awfully lot, Bullying Alone, that he wrote in the late 1990s, talking about how we began to move away from all organizations. Churches have lost, or service organizations have lost. 100% of the student parents used to belong to PTAs in the mid-70s. Now it's hard to get people to attend. Is this part of a bigger picture that brought us to where we are today?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think there's two parts to it. One is that the decline in community means that the everyday friction that you might have, for instance, going to a church. Go to church, you interact with people who are 30 or 50 years older than you or younger than you. You interact with people of different political views. If you no longer have a church community to go to, you're likely to be more narrowly connected to people who are just in your same age group. Just one example, but yes, that decline in community helps accelerate some of the misunderstandings between groups, because we just don't have natural organic friction in social conversations, social interactions with people who are of different communities in the way that we used to. So that's the first way in which it's a problem. The second way in which the decline in community is a problem is that where people are turning in the absence of in-person community is often to online communities and social media. And people are looking for a tribe. They're looking for the rush of belonging. And oftentimes where they find that is in judgmental activist groups or in hateful groups. And these are places where people can feel like they have a place of belonging because they have a very clear identity. And so social media isn't providing the same quality of community that in-person communities have. At least it isn't yet. Yeah. So I agree. It's a big problem, and it could be a very big part of the solution too, if we could restore communities in this country.
Other questions?
I see a lot here in the chat from Dennis. Should we start with some of those?
Dennis Wong, very definitely. Hello, Dennis.
Hello. Thank you. Yeah, I gave some things on the chat. And one of the things in listening, I just wondered, one of the things, what we have in common, what we see ourselves as Americans and what kind of life we want to live. And one of the things that I'm affected by, Senator George Mitchell, who talked about in Northern Ireland, where we all want the same things. We want to be safe, want to be able to have a decent job where we can see our kids go off to school and be successful, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I believe that. I think one of the challenges that we groups, people have different ideas on how to get there. Basically, especially when you talk about like safety and policing, there's a difference between a rich suburb versus, inner city, as far as how to, both people want safety, people are looking for safety, just that, how it's, I guess, addressed is maybe different. And I just wondered, in your surveys and things is the fact that maybe there's a way of digging out what the common things that people want and are looking for, and then discussing how to get there. And also part of the thing about how to get there, I think I got a sense that most people think we're in a zero-sum game, that whatever you spend on one person is taken away from the other, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, that's based some of the things that are going in my mind, and what your statistics in your study showed that, again, stimulated things that idea. And only the last point is I want to make before Stephen, Rotary is trying to be a problem solver, this idea of peace building and conflict prevention. And so maybe you can help us do a better job as far as whatever we do. But thank you very much for your presentation.
Well, thanks so much, Dennis. I'd love to help out where I can with the group. Really, I would. I'll just add just two small comments to what you said there. One about the zero sum. I think the place where the zero sum idea comes up a lot is around identity. Right now, a lot of there's a concept on the left that because especially straight white men have had such a shaping influence and so much power and so much privilege in this country, it's not their time anymore, and that we need to correct for that. And there's this reaction on the right that that's a form of racism. And that I'm feeling about how to elevate others so that there's diversity, equity, inclusion without being hypocritical and being racist in your own way is a really, really, really big conversation that's happening all across university campuses and in elite organizations. And it's because of exactly what you said around zero sum. There's this sense that if others are being brought into the circle, it's going to come at my cost. And it just affirms to me the importance of having conversations of empathy and evidence, because a lot of people are very threatened right now by this change in demographics and change in culture related to that. And we're not quite getting it right as a country, in my view. And then I have a lot of thoughts also on the point about wanting the same things. But I think to distill it in one way, I think the thing we need to worry about is almost religious identities on the far left and the far right, causing us to not just think about our material, practical well-being, but feeling a sense of disgust at each other. And the level of hostility that we have towards our political opponents means that we're often unable to sort of look at practical questions about making sure our needs are met. And we're really, really focused on threats to our children. The conservative right is very concerned about what's being taught around transgender identity to students. And from the far left, there's a concern that racism is still very rampant in the country. And it makes it very hard, very noisy to have a conversation about practical things when we feel so under threat. So all the more reason for us to try and build a shared American identity where we feel that our values are all in the conversation when we work on problems together.
Tom Baker.
Yes, very interesting presentation, Stephen. I'm a retired educator, and so how do you see the role of public education in creating this common identity, and what do you see in the past 2 decades that has hindered the institution of public education in creating and perpetuating that common identity?
So three points on this, I think. One is that there's not enough emphasis on civics. If you talk to people on the left and the right, they'll agree with you on this, that students are graduating without necessarily having the ability to articulate what it is to be part of a democracy and how it works. So that's the first one. And groups are working on that right now, including here in Colorado. The Daniels Foundation is working on trying to start a nationwide civics bee, like the spelling bee, that would encourage middle school age children to compete in their knowledge of civics. So that's the first one, is this problem of civics. The second is, especially on college campuses, there's a new notion around political conversations in general, which is that we need to protect people from harm or even protect them from violence. And that can be violence, can be someone saying something that's offensive in the classroom. And that idea of there are dangerous and bad thoughts that can't be spoken in the classroom, and I am the person who's going to police them, is an idea which has really started to warp and shape the university context, the academic context. And so now people in the center and people on the left and people on the right are worried about the university setting being compromised by this kind of informal set of new social norms around policing language and ideas. So I work with groups like the Constructive Dialogue Institute that are trying to improve the quality of discourse on university campuses. And the reason I'm bringing that up, Tom, is because it means that conservatives are now less likely to want to send their kids to university campuses because they feel like it's less of an education and more of an indoctrination. It's a really big problem, right? You need to have universities as a neutral space. Third part of this is the politicization of teaching American history. And now this is a problem where there's a lot more bark than there is bite. Across the country, a lot of Republican legislators have legislated restrictions on what can be taught around American history because of what's called critical race theory. It's been talked about a lot in Fox News and other conservative media. We find that in our research, we released a report last month that looked at this subject of teaching American history. There's a lot of common ground. There's a lot of common belief, as I showed in the presentation, that the United States is a flawed country, but getting better, that we have personal responsibility. We shouldn't be making kids feel guilty. But there's a lot of fear and anxiety on the right that children are being taught to, Black children are being taught to resent their white classmates, or white kids are being taught to feel guilty for what their great-grandparents were part of. So the school arena has become politicized in a way that is mostly just affecting parents. The kids are actually not typically involved in being given this kind of politically oriented education around American identity. But it's made teaching American history complicated and tense and politicized, and brought it into the cable news world. So that's something we've got to work through too as well. If you're interested in that, I'm going to just put the link to this study on that's the link to the study we released in December. Got written about in the Washington Post and Financial Times and a few other places. So yeah, hope that was helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Great. And Richard Denton, you have your hand up from Canada.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you very much, Stephen. This morning, I was on another webinar put on by the Association of Conflict Resolution, and the speaker was talking about conflict resilience, and that it should be something to be embraced and to not run away from. And it seems that what you've all your various graphs have shown is that Democrats and Republicans are actually very similar. Yes, there's differences between the right and the left, but it's not reflected in the party system. And so therefore, the idea would be to get people to talking to each other, realize that on one hand, you may hate them, the other side, but on the other hand, if you listen, you can certainly find common ground. And I was just sort of again wondering what is your approach to that?
No, I do agree with that. And conflict is good. It's useful to have this tension between conservative and liberal perspectives. I agree with that. You know, we need to have friction, useful friction, to find answers and to compete for the best performance. I don't know if any of you knows Tom Cosgrove. I imagine some of you probably do, who also lives in Boulder, but he and his wife, Kirsten, have done some documentaries where they brought Republicans and Democrats together who expected to hate each other and then became lifelong friends and are friends now years later, and released a documentary on PBS about this. And then there are groups like Braver Angels that do this as a practice, where they just bring together groups of Republicans and Democrats to have dinner and have conversations. And the results of those initiatives, Richard, align with your intuitions here, which is that once people get into conversation, they often find that they have a lot more that they enjoy about the other side than they expect. The problem is how to scale that up at a level that affects hundreds of millions of people. And that's the kind of big question, is how do you build enough community and build enough habitual interactions that people absorb that knowledge, that they learn that people are they have a lot in common with other people and can trust them. And then that defines their perspective more than the negative media depictions of those same people.
Wow, great. And Bob Loeffler.
Thank you. Mr. Hawkins, that was quite an excellent presentation, but I admit that this is the first time I've joined one of Jim Halderman's programs, and so maybe I'm easily overawed, but I'm going to look forward to more of Jim's programs in the future. I was following on what Richard spoke about. There were two slides that showed the overlap of interests, if you will. And I was wondering if there's any way we could get copies of those slides. You had one where you had the different identities had come to these different conclusions, and then you had a comparison. And when I saw the comparison, I immediately said, those aren't in conflict. And then you said they're not in conflict. That's the one slide. And then the other one, it was more of a strange diagram, but it was showing how there seemed to be profound, like almost 75% agreement among all these different groups. And I'm not sure why I would like to see those. I don't know how I would use them, but I feel like those might be useful in some way, and at least getting somebody to listen, or getting me to listen. So if there's some way to get those, I'd appreciate it. And so I thank you very much for your presentation. Jim, thank you.
Sure. I'm happy to send the presentation to Jim, and then maybe Jim, you can circulate it to anyone who's interested. And Jim, you owe me one for making such a good strong first impression on Bob.
And I do indeed, and I'll find a way because this has been very valuable. One last question, if I may. And one of the things that I see or feel is that people are taking their there's a self-identity that's stronger than it used to be. I am a Republican, I am a Democrat, and we are defining who we are as our label, not realizing that we are many things, much more than any one label. But that, so when a thought or a belief is challenged, you're challenging me and not my thought. You know, are we self-identifying stronger than we used to? You know, how can we move that identity over here so we can talk about this over here, removing who I am from this label?
I totally agree. And, you know, coming back to this point about American identity, because maybe what the alternative to you're a Democrat, I'm a Republican is we're both American. Everybody talks about September 11th as a period in which people felt like they came together as Americans. But that's not good news, because it shows that having an external threat or an enemy is necessary to keep us feeling close together, make us feel connected. During the second half of the 20th century, as you'll all know and remember, the Soviet Union was this big ugly, terrifying threat, atheist, secular, communist, authoritarian power. And although the United States was going through so much turmoil in terms of gender and sexuality and racial justice and so on in the second half of the 20th century, having that opposing enemy was useful because it meant there was meaning to being shared as Americans. So right now, since we don't have that, and as I said, most people think that the other political party is the biggest threat to the country, it makes it hard for us to take off these Republican Democrat identities and think about each other as individuals or think about each other as shared Americans. But I agree that it's the challenge ahead of us, and my hope would be that not just a negative threat, but a positive aspirational vision of what America can be and what America can do for the world could be so inspiring as to draw people to feel closer to each other, even across the party lines. That's my hope.
Stephen, this has been fantastic. And do you have one last line you want to make? Is there a closing comment you'd like to make?
There's not. I'll just put on the screen here. If anyone's interested in supporting me as I launch this media venture, I'm just going to put this up on the screen one last time. And this is a bit of a shameless plug. But if you just take out your phone and you open your camera and scan this QR code here, then you'll get a link to my fundraiser page and to my trailer and to some more information about it. So if you're inspired to do so, I'd be very grateful. I'm going to close out my fundraising here in the next few days. Yeah,
I just copied that, and I have a feeling you've developed, and I hope that you've developed some followers here in your program, and I hope be even better yet, maybe some supporters. Phenomenal material, tremendous work.
Thank you so much,
Stephen,
Jim.
thank you for sharing this phenomenal, extensive knowledge.
I'm very grateful to spend this time with you. And in reference to who was it? Was it Dennis or Peter? Tom, thank you all for your questions. And if I can ever be of help to you, or if I can make any connections or offer any advice or review anything you're doing or in any other way be helpful, please do let me know. I'm very grateful.
We'll stay in touch. And if you send the PowerPoint, I'll be happy to share that with anyone who asks. So next month, we will hear from Patricia Schaefer on Connecting for Peace. She's a senior fellow for peace education at the Washington, D.C. based America for Peace Building, recipient of several national awards. And so next month too will be good. But Stephen, once again, we thank you so much. And we wish you all a great evening.
Thanks, everyone. It's been my pleasure. Have a good night.
Thank you.